Hi, and welcome to Legally Insane News. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. Find and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Kyle O'Donnell, and head over to legallyinsanefilms.com to listen to my other podcasts, to read my books and articles, to check out my photos from around the world, and to watch my documentary films. Again, that's legallyinsanefilms.com. The second story for the Legally Insane News Hour is monkeypox. So I guess kind of monkeypox. I don't mean to jump on the bandwagon with everybody there, but it's apparently the next best fear-mongering tactic by the media at large. And whopping dozen cases announced on Monday, which progressed to an even more scary 45 cases by Friday. They say this like, kind of like it's spreading like wildfire, but only if that wildfire exists in your sock drawer. And can I just say here that the name monkeypox, it just feels like the next thing that logically follows something like, bird flu and mad cow and swine flu. I mean, I just wonder what's next. I'm thinking like squirrel fever or like horse hiccups. Just as we saw with the media frenzy that caused so much more harm than good amid the COVID-19 quote-unquote pandemic, the mass media has wasted no time in jumping right onto its next biohazard bandwagon. That's right. If beating the war drum didn't get us into a full-blown nuclear war with Russia, monkeypox is the next safe harbor to keep Americans scared and, of course, glued to our television screens for the latest updates on the world of media frenzy. So here's the timeline. Monday, America had, I think, 12 cases in 12 states. Tuesday, that shot up to 13. I know, crazy jump. That number ascended to 30 by Wednesday, which is more than double, before plateauing to, I think, 40 by Thursday. And they had a huge whopping spike of 5 new cases, bringing the total to 45 cases in 15 states throughout the week. What a week for the onset of a brand new fear-mongering campaign. I can't even believe they're actually making this a part of news coverage. Tell me I'm wrong. This is not news coverage. I mean, on Friday, that conversation shifted to make the jump to monkeypox being associated or even like being confused with sexually transmitted diseases. The CDC announced that the cases had doubled from somewhere mid 20s to 45, in 1 week. When that's the only thing in the title, monkeypox cases have doubled in 1 week. Wow. You would think that would be, like major media news networks would be like, oh, well, let's just do a little research before we share this. No, they're not doing that at all. They're literally quoting the CDC saying that monkeypox cases has doubled. They don't even talk about how many cases. It's like talking about like 8 candidates for the presidency that you like and leaving out the 9th, talking about it. And all these people are leading in the polls, and you just sort of leave the last one out. That's kind of like the opposite of what they're doing with monkeypox in terms of leaving the data out. Just 2 paragraphs below the CNBC article was like this 4-minute video stating that the next pandemic threat came down from everywhere. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. I had such a hard time with this one because a pandemic surrounding us from all sides, that it's literally coming from everywhere. I just see back in the 20s and 30s when there was like a reefer madness. I think of it all as reefer madness at this point. It's just all hoax talk, It goes on to quote that healthcare providers should not rule out monkeypox just because a patient has another diagnosis or another sexually transmitted infection, which is, part of this article is it's now being sort of confused with sexually transmitted diseases and infections. They're basically in this article warning doctors and patients that even if you go in for a routine checkup, even if you're at a 0 risk for catching monkeypox, you could still have monkeypox. Anyway, I've told myself I wasn't going to go too deep into the monkeypox thing. I'm a teacher by nature, so I kind of look at it as a teachable moment. This gives me the opportunity for that teachable moment. So instead of joining onto the monkeypox bandwagon, I'm just going to use this as a moment of learning. after all, I am a professor, and that teachable moment presents itself almost every major news story that I've read this week. They're all teachable moments. And I really like taking jabs at the establishment. That, if that hasn't made itself pretty clear to you by now, it probably won't be unless I point it out. But that's basically got the value of potty humor unless those jabs actually come across with a lesson. So as a professor, I always task my students with considering 3 things about every story they come across. You know, there are a lot of them. Obviously, you're going to see 20 news stories a day pass through your apps. So first, sponge them out with 3 precursors, right? The first of the 3 should be kept in mind at all times. These first 3 that I'm going to detail. And then there's 2 other little like helpful hints that I'm going to detail after that. It should the first 3 not kind of pass the sniff test. All right. Number 1, consider the agenda. All right. This seems obvious, of course, and a lot of people say it, but you do need to ask yourself, why is this story being written? Like, what other stories are happening right now and are being talked about, you know, using the same facts, and like, what are those stories actually saying? And a wonderful way to find out is to do an internet search, right? I mean, obviously you're going to do an internet search, but how do you actually do that and know you're not just being filtered through the same machine, right? So what you want to do is you look through the article, or you listen to the podcast, or whatever it is. You take a handful of the biggest buzzwords given in that article or broadcast, and you plug those into an internet search. But I recommend not using major searches like Google, right? Because they obviously have a skin in the game. They have a stake in what they return to you, right? Their search results will have to benefit them. They've got social media platforms. They've got advertisers and constituencies to kind of like adhere, not adhere to, but to pay back for their advertising dollars. So that's who they service first, like any good business does. But in fact, they're not going to return anything that's not at least first, like the top of the list, that's not going to benefit these entities. So I recommend using, Yahoo to an extent. They still do the same thing, but less of an extent. Bing, or even better yet, download the Tor browser. And if you don't know what that is, it's spelled Tor. Just Google it. Or you can use a VPN and search the same way. And this is going to give you the least amount of filters to help balance out what you'll get back from all those perspectives. At least that's the hope. Okay, on to number 2. Consider the source. You've heard this a lot. Who is writing the article or releasing the podcast? What was their position in the past? Does taking a certain side of a debate like sort of help push another angle that they've pressed for in the past? A very simple way to do this is to simply get off your normal apps and websites and look in different news providers, right? For instance, if you're used to using YouTube to search for your stories, take the same searches and put them in minds.com or bitshoot.com or odyssey.com or other platforms that I like to call aftermarket media. And if you're interested in a list of the ones that I use, send me an email to thejusticepod@gmail.com and I'll get you that list there. Okay, so third on the list, consider the timing. A lot of people don't really, they get sort of focused on one story. It's so crazy. Oh my God, it's happening in our community or our state. I can't believe this. And they kind of forget that there's other things happening in the world. And it seems sort of like you wouldn't be doing that, but you really do get pulled in at times. And just consider when something is released and look and maybe find out if there are bills sitting before Congress right now that a certain story might influence in some way. If a story is really huge, but it doesn't really seem to warrant that much media coverage, like what else is happening in the world? Is the story being used to flank another issue or to draw attention away from a foreign bombing campaign, which happens like way more than most people would imagine? Maybe it's being used to like hijack a conversation that would otherwise kind of draw a critical perspective of a position or a publication or maybe a certain politician. A great place to find out what's happening in the world is that list that I mentioned above. Shoot me an email. I'll get that out to you. There are several other considerations that you really must try and stick to when you're assessing whether or not a story is fake or it's over frenzied or all of those things. But those first three, that's kind of like your first line of attack when you're really looking for a wealth of rational answers to just about any nonsensical mass media frenzy question you'll ever ask. The two final pieces of advice that I've found that consistently offer valuable answers, many kind of seemingly unanswered questions crop up throughout the media, and those are the following. When you read an article or you listen to a broadcast of some kind and you can't answer the question of why, as in like, why did the U.S. invade Iraq when we found no weapons of mass destruction? And then immediately follow that up with a equally questionable invasion of Afghanistan. The best thing I've ever told anyone to do in those moments is to insert the word money into those equations. And that almost always gives you heaps of options to choose from in terms of answers to those. In this example that I just pointed out, the Iraq and Afghanistan invasions, it's no coincidence that George W. Bush led the invasion of both of these countries, while Dick Cheney, the former chairman and CEO of Halliburton, was the vice president. For those of you unaware, maybe just didn't pay attention or too young at the time, the reason that it's no coincidence is that Halliburton went on to win billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars in securities and construction contracts in the wake of these invasions. And all of the, and this is in the face of all of the contract bids entered from all the different companies across all the different countries around the world that put in other bids. The notion that our government looked the other way while mass media coincidentally wouldn't report on the fact that Halliburton beat out all of those other bids in what came to be known as a no bid contract process is equally not incidental. About the closest they came to paying any attention whatsoever was, I think the headliner for this was a September 27th, 2004 article in the New York Times that quotes, "The Bush campaign maintains that Mr. Cheney has cut all ties with Halliburton and that the administration has given the company no special treatment." Again, I'm looking for that crickets chirping soundbite here, which should prompt you to be thinking inquisitively. In case you're missing my meaning here, this is a lie that the government sponsored and mass media propagated. There is no other way to say it. And history is full of them. Like that's just one, I hate to say tiny example, but just one in the mix of who knows how many, dozens, hundreds. And the sheeple of America swallowed that lie, hook, line, and sinker. This report didn't come out until 3 years after the invasion of Iraq, which also happened to be just less than 1 year after Dick Cheney left his position at Halliburton. And we're talking about he was chairing a global company for 15 years. He quits. Less than a year later, he and Bush invade Iraq. And by the way, Cheney also happened to have continued receiving taxable compensation from Halliburton for many years after. And Cheney just also happened to have continued receiving taxable compensation from his former employer all throughout the war. And yet there was no more scrutiny given to this issue than a weekend read in the New York Times. The world did nothing. We acted like nothing ever happened. We moved on. I didn't, though. I spent 3 weeks on a report for one of my journalism classes at IU, slamming everything that the Bush cabinet and mass media stood for in that obvious collusion of outright lies to the American people. In the end, as always, nothing changes when not enough people demand that change, and that's what happened here. I'm thankful, though, to report that since that time, I really wasn't alone. I felt alone. I felt kind of helpless looking up at this big, giant White House with my hands up going, WTF, bro? In the years since then, I am so happy to see that independent media has finally gathered up its guts and put its head on and started spouting truth. Which leads me to the second thing, and hopefully final thing that I'm going to rant about on this one, that one should always ask himself when hearing what appear to be kind of echoes of news stories around the world without any sort of governmental pundits or White House correspondents dashing those claims, right? When the government and the mass media at large, and I'm including social media in this statement, do not agree, or worse, they actually do agree on a certain subject, the hairs on the nape of your neck should be standing at attention. This usually only means one of a few things. It could mean that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? In other words, like when there's no blowback from mass media over what's happening in Washington, that's usually because the media is benefiting from the affair in some way, like either in terms of a scandal to cast out like clickbait or gossip value, or even like passage of legislation that makes fake news even easier to spread. Then there's B. The opposite may be true as well, meaning that a given spike in coverage potentiates momentum in a certain element of political benefit to a party that may currently be in power, for good or ill, which regardless how it plays out, bad is always good for someone in Washington, right? I mean, like if it's bad for one party, it's usually good for another. A perfect example of this is former President Trump's seemingly endless cringe moments that, if not for him being president, would not be news at all. At times it seems that his announcements on Twitter were getting more news than the policies that he implemented, and that should ultimately never be news. Like it should never be news unless there's a declaration of war or something on Twitter. I mean, like it's Twitter. I've never taken it that seriously. All of a sudden it's policy wrangling. Moving on to option C. Lastly, it could be an active, calculated partisan sort of agreement between the government and mass media themselves to sort of engage in a campaign of, say, censorship or whatever, redirecting misinformational narrative shifting ideology they might be hatching under the guise of fomenting truth by protecting the poor, uninformed American people of the mysterious, powerful disinformation machine churning day and night in an effort to send us all into chaos. I got a newsflash for you here. We're already in chaos, and it's not because a handful of wackos have an internet connection, right? In one of the most despicable displays of being caught having both of their hands in the same cookie jar, major social media platforms, including Facebook and Twitter, complied with government requests to flag, shadow ban, and even remove posts, comments, and accounts of those making claims that went against stated claims of the Biden administration. So this, of course, surrounded the often daily changes to the COVID-19 information horizon, which has ultimately seen itself dashed altogether in the latest data from vaccine and viral infection research. Did I make it through that? I'm gonna pin this down for you. This is how you spot fake news. Okay. When any disease, disorder, or virus, or basically anything else that's less than tens of thousands of cases nationwide, it's not a real threat, right? There's 300 million people in America. Doubling the threat from whatever it was to 45 in 1 week. That's not newsworthy, right? Not that shouldn't be prepared for, right? Not that the CDC shouldn't be, taking note of it, right? But we need to start as critical listeners and consumers of media, start actually being critical. Start actually saying, is this really newsworthy? Do I really? I mean, am I going to spend my afternoon at the coffee machine talking about this with my coworker? If it's not newsworthy, stop paying attention to it. Stop clicking on it. The mass media of the world, not that I care about what they do, but other than influencing the sheeple who make a pretty big dent in legislation, not that I really ultimately care about their policies, but the way to change them automatically and without literally doing anything is not clicking, refusing to click on stories that you see immediately are just not newsworthy. If they don't get the clicks, they don't get the advertising dollars. If they don't get the advertising dollars, they change the pace of their news production, right? Their programming immediately and automatically becomes more of what's relevant to you. So stop clicking on useless shit. That's spotting fake news rule number one. Number two, when the numbers are so abysmal, right, that it's not really newsworthy, those numbers that I was talking about, less than 10,000 or so or whatever it was, you have to ask yourself why they're reporting it. Like, what else is happening at that time? That goes back to those three washable media points, right? The major networks were actually reporting that monkeypox was actually not a threat. Like my first question when I heard that was like, so why are they reporting it? What's so important about a non-threatening bug that comes on prime television? Like, think about it. Think about how much effort goes into telling the news, right? Researching the news, producing the news, airing the news. Think of the expense of paying all the people in the line of putting it out there, the advertising expenses, the station promotions. And yet they go through all of that to report something that's no big deal. That's not what news is about, people. News is supposed to be impactful, important, so rare and extraordinary that it makes the news. The news is supposed to be reserved for useful information like record-breaking Olympic accomplishments or noteworthy inventions or outstanding accomplishments like moon landings and military victories, right? That's what it's supposed to be about. Think about it. And think critically, right? All of these mass media, media being used as a plural, are telling you, I can assure you the majors like Fox and CNBC and CNN, all of those other guys, they're circling around non-issues like sharks circling a wounded diver for a reason, right? That does not happen coincidentally. Just ask yourselves why. And the last one on this, and it's kind of an assumption, I dare to say a prediction, is they're preparing to turn monkeypox into the next big scare. This is the last thing. Like, when you hear something that's useless crap, it's because it's useless crap that they're building up for later. And as the numbers of infections don't support the news broadcasts covering it, we'll still see something come in well ahead of real threats kind of going on in the world, like, as the U.S. bombs a small village in northern Sudan, and that ultimately never makes the news, right? Always wash it through the filters. And with that, I'm going to end my rant for this one as well. Thanks so much for listening to the Legally Insane News Hour. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. We'll see you next time. That's it for this edition of Legally Insane News. Make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Kyle O'Donnell for updates and extras on this and other stories. If you're listening to this podcast at legallyinsanefilms.com or the Small Town Justice page, be sure to also download the Spreaker app, where you can directly subscribe and help me bump up my download totals. If you like this episode of Legally Insane News, consider becoming a supporting member. For just $3, you can get access to members-only unreleased articles and podcasts, case files on our latest investigations, updates for events and conventions that we're attending, and discounts on swag. To do that, just head over to patreon.com/legallyinsanefilms. There are 3 different memberships, each with more content than the one before. This is where I release all of my documentary films with outtakes and extras, as well as another podcast called Small Town Justice. You can check those out by going to legallyinsanefilms.com and clicking Join the Fan Club. Send any questions, comments, feedback, and show ideas to thejusticepod@gmail.com. This has been a production of Legally Insane Films, LLC. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. We'll see you next time.